Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. I've been a park ranger since I was 18, and after 5 years in these woods, I can't picture myself doing anything else. Used to be a Boy Scout back in the day, and I've always been a hiker, a real outdoorsy type. For me, time spent in the woods is time well spent, so getting to work out here every day, it's a freaking dream come true. But being a ranger, especially in a place like this, you see some things. You see your share of, well, bodies. People come out here thinking they're invincible, ready to hike and swim and take on nature. They forget that nature can bite back. They run into trouble with animals, get swept away in the rapids, forget enough food or water, or just wander off the trail and get lost. Sometimes it takes days, even weeks, before someone stumbles on them. But the spring of 2023, that was the year the butterflies started helping, I guess you could say. It all started with a woman named Bethany Price. But trust me, it didn't end there. Bethany was what you'd call a minimalist camper, the kind who'd show up with just the bare essentials and a ratty old blanket. She'd set up camp wherever she felt like it, just drop and sleep, no tent, no nothing. She knew her plants, which ones would keep you alive, which ones would kill you. That was good. She also knew which ones would get you higher than a kite, which was not so good. We'd had to call the cops on Bethany more than a few times, but they always let her go after a couple of months. And the higher ups at the park wouldn't ban her for life, so she just kept coming back. Then, one day, a couple of hikers come to us, saying they found a body out in a place we call the meadow. Right then, we figured this would probably be the last time we'd have to call the cops on Bethany. She was naked, which, unfortunately, wasn't that unusual for her. It's not like she was bad to look at, but finding someone butt naked out in the elements was always a little weird. This time, though, she was splayed out, arms and legs spread wide, right in the middle of the wildflowers. Her eyes and tongue were gone. That wasn't all that uncommon either. Not with all the critters running around the park. But those little black spikes all over her skin, that was definitely something new. Something I'd never seen before. They were in perfect rows, 3 rows of them, each spike about 3 inches long, maybe 9 spikes in each line. Aside from the spikes, the weirdest part was the butterflies. I'd never seen this kind before. They were this pale, almost bone, white color, with these delicate black patterns on their wings. There were a ton of them all over the body, and I figured that's what caught the hikers' attention. They were swirling around in a thick cloud, those white wings easy to spot against all the green of the trees. Honestly, I was as freaked out by the butterflies as I was by those weird spikes on her skin. What the hell are these things? I asked, reaching out a finger to touch one of the spikes, expecting it to be sharp, but it was all squishy and full of this nasty green liquid. Polydamores, said Alex, one of the other rangers. Come again. In English, for those of us who didn't take Latin in high school, I said. Pale death, he said, nodding towards the butterflies. They're pretty rare. I don't think I've ever actually seen one in real life. They're supposed to live way out in the deep woods, and they only come out every few years to lay their eggs. I pointed at the row of black spikes running up Bethany's thigh. Undead bodies. Alex nodded. That's why they call them palidomores. They lay their eggs on corpses, usually animals. I've heard stories about them using human bodies, but it's rare. Guess they found her before we did. The hikers told us pretty much the same thing. They were heading to the meadow, his girlfriend wanting to see it in the spring, and as they got to the end of the trail, she spotted the swarm of pale butterflies and wanted a closer look. She thought they were beautiful, but as they got closer, they saw the body and realized what the butterflies were all over. We called it in, and a couple of guys from the coroner's office came out to collect her. Part of me hoped that would be the last body we found that spring. But deep down, I think I knew. I knew this wasn't going to be the last time I saw a body being taken out of the park that year. Not by a long shot. The next one we found was a hiker named Marcus Bell, and the way he went was just terrible. It gives me chills just thinking about it. See, we've got this river that runs through the park, the Conestoga River. It's a beauty, popular with the fishermen, especially during trout season. Well, a family was out there, fishing, trying to catch some trout as they were heading upstream to their spawning grounds. One of their kids, a little boy, he wanders off a bit like kids do. He comes running back to his mom, all freaked out, saying he saw a monster in the river. He said it looked like a giant, scaled claw sticking out of the water. Naturally, the mom figures it's just a weird rock, or maybe a log with some moss on it, right? Kids have wild imaginations, but she goes to check it out anyway, and what they find? Well, it wasn't a rock. It was an arm, a human arm, sticking straight up out of the water, and it was covered in those same black, spiky pods that we found on Bethany. They looked just like scales. The mom told me later, still shaken up. I could see why he thought it was a monster's hand. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized it was an arm, sticking up out of the foam. At first, we figured the guy had just fallen into the river, gotten himself wedged between some rocks and drowned. A tragic accident, it happens. But when we finally managed to pull him out, that's when we saw the full extent of it. It was way worse than we thought. Something had shoved him into that tight space between the rocks, and it hadn't been gentle. His shoulders were snapped, completely broken in half and folded up. He was crumpled up in that hole like a discarded suit jacket. And that wasn't even the worst part. Something had eaten his face off. Not like Bethany, where it was just her eyes and tongue. This was gone. His entire face, all the way down to the bone. Just ragged flesh and this gleaming white skull. If it hadn't been for that arm sticking up, we probably wouldn't have found him until some poor soul panning for minerals found a finger bone or a piece of his skull. And hovering over the whole scene, like they were running the show, were those damn butterflies, the pale death. After that, things got really bad, really fast. We found 4 more bodies in just 1 month. One was a guy up on the mountainside, his hands missing, his nose and lips chewed clean off. He'd been climbing one of the smaller mountains we have in the park, and when he didn't come back, we initially thought maybe a small avalanche from the snow melt. But then a fisherman found him, laid out on the lowest peak, and we knew it was something much more sinister. The second one was a woman. She'd gone into the woods to take a leak during a picnic, and they found her, well, half of her, in the low branches of a tree. The other half was way up high in the same tree, and something had eaten her legs. Her husband had to be hospitalized after he identified what was left of his wife. I felt awful for her kids. They came out here for a nice family picnic, and something took that away from them, took their mom away. The third one was, unfortunately, a little girl. Her name was Haley Miller. She would have turned 6 in July, but she never got the chance. Haley's case was the strangest, and also the easiest to identify. It looked like she'd wandered off from her parents' campsite in the middle of the night. But the thing is, whatever found her, it seemed to have taken an interest in her, like it had been taking care of her. There was evidence that something had been feeding her. Something had changed her clothes. Something had made sure she was drinking clean water. But then, whatever it was, it slipped up. Haley hadn't died because her face was eaten off. She died because she fell hard. Her skull was cracked. It was pretty clear she'd fallen out of a tree, but the coroner said she would have had to fall from a pretty serious height. She was stretched out, too, like someone had made her comfortable as she lay there, dying. The fourth one, though, that was the worst. That was the one that changed everything. The fourth one was one of our own, Ranger Frank Kowalski. He'd gone out to check on one of the pump stations. We had 6 of them, scattered around the park, used to bring fresh water to the campgrounds. He was responding to a call about a malfunction at Station 4. He headed out before lunch, and we found what was left of him the next day when he never came back. If he hadn't been wearing his name tag, we wouldn't have known who it was. His arms and legs were gone, probably eaten. His face was gone, so was the top of his skull, and everything that used to be inside. Something had gnawed at his chest, eaten his backside, and chewed his genitals clean off. He was just a torso and a piece of a head when we found him at the edge of the woods. A lot of us were pretty shaken up after that, losing one of our own like that. And over all of these bodies, those damn butterflies were there, like they were presiding over some kind of ritual. And those black, spiky eggs were always there, too. We all knew something was seriously wrong. We were expecting a visit from the head ranger, but when he showed up the next day with a guy in a dark suit, we knew things were about to get real. So, the head ranger, Mr. Henderson, shows up, and he's not alone. He's got this guy with him, dressed in a dark suit, looking like he's more at home in a boardroom than out in the woods. He had a few other guys with him, all in similar suits, and I saw Alex lift an eyebrow. These guys looked like they haven't walked on anything rougher than a sidewalk, but it was clear that they have some plans for us. "This is Agent Miller, Monsieur," Henderson says, introducing the main suit guy. "He's here to help us with our situation. We're going to be splitting all of you into groups to canvass the woods." We need to find whatever's doing this, and we need to find it before the summer season really kicks off, especially now that one of our own is a victim. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so each group of rangers will be paired with two of Agent Miller's men. They'll be there to guide you, show you what to look for, and help bring this whole thing to an end. So that's how I ended up out in the woods with Agents Thompson and Davis. Agent Miller might have looked like a banker, but these two had traded their fancy suits for camo gear and some serious firepower. They were carrying assault rifles, which was a little intense. We grabbed our shotguns, the ones we usually use to scare off bears or the occasional aggressive moose, just to add to the arsenal. And the three of us headed out into the woods. Agent Thompson was the quiet type, didn't say much. But Agent Davis, he made up for it. He was full of questions, wanted to know everything about what we'd seen, the bodies, the mutilations, those damn butterflies. Butterflies. Agent Thompson finally spoke up, the first words I'd heard him say in the hour we'd been walking. "Yeah," I said. "Alex calls them something in Latin. Basically means pale death. They show up around the bodies, like they're marking them or something." Thompson and Davis exchanged this look, like they knew something we didn't. "Have you seen anything else near the sites? Footprints, maybe. Scales, anything that looks like insect skin?" Davis asked. I shook my head. "No, mostly just, dead people." I was about to ask them what the hell they thought we were looking for, since they clearly knew more than they were letting on when we came to this clearing. It wasn't exactly a clearing, though. It was more like infested. It was swarming with those pale butterflies, more than I'd ever seen in one place. As we walked in, they fluttered around us, almost like they were happy to see us, if butterflies can be happy. The two agents took it as a good sign, but me, I wasn't so sure. These things had been nothing but bad news since they showed up. Finding a whole bunch of them now didn't exactly fill me with confidence. As we moved deeper into the cloud of butterflies, I started to get this really uneasy feeling, like we were being watched. And then I saw it. Through the swirling mass of insects, there was this shadow stalking us. At first, it looked almost human-sized, but the longer I watched it flit through the swarm, the bigger it seemed to get. I couldn't tell how many arms it had. Could have been 2, could have been 8, for all I knew. But the wings, those I could see, and they were huge and white, just like the smaller butterflies. It was using them like a blind, like it was trying to lure us in deeper. "It's close," Davis whispered, his voice tight. "Steady," Thompson said, his hand on his weapon. "If we spook it, it might get away before we can take it down." "What?" I half whispered, probably too loud, but I was too scared to care. Thompson looked at Davis, and I saw something in his face. I guess it was resignation. "You ever hear of the Muthmen?" Thompson asked me. "Well, there are others, different kinds. Folks in Joplin, they talk about how their kids were saved from a tornado by these butterfly people. They think the ones who died were taken by the storm, but we know better. We call them Lycanidae bipedus, and they're extremely..." But he never got to finish his sentence. Suddenly, the butterflies were all over us, a solid wall of them. We couldn't see a thing. They were hitting us, clinging to us. I heard the roar of one of the agent's automatic weapons, and I just hit the ground and started crawling. I had to get out of that swarm, away from the gunfire. I could hear yelling, then this wet, tearing sound that cut off one of the screams, but the gunfire kept going. I just kept crawling, low to the ground, trying to get out of that cloud of insects. I crawled until I was clear of the clearing, and once the butterflies weren't all over me, I got up and started running. I could still hear the gunfire behind me, but all I could think about was getting away, about staying alive. I knew that if I stayed, I was dead, and I really, really wanted to live. I ran until someone yelled at me to stop and shoved a gun in my face. It was another one of the agents, and as more of them showed up, they ordered me to take them back to where I'd left Agent Thompson. As much as I didn't want to go back there, I knew I didn't have a choice. By the time we found the clearing again, Agent Thompson was sitting on something he'd covered with a tarp. His left arm was hanging limp at his side. His clothes were shredded, but he was grinning like he'd just bagged a prize-winning buck. "Jet it to the truck," he said, his voice rough. "Tell the boys back at base I had no choice. It wouldn't come peacefully." It forced my hand. Agent Davis was dead. They had him covered with a tarp too, but I saw him before they did. Something had torn his throat out. I figured it was whatever was under the tarp that Thompson was guarding. They took both the tarp bodies away, and when Thompson came towards me, I thought maybe he'd be angry that I ran. Instead, he just put a hand on my shoulder and nodded, like he understood. "Don't beat yourself up, kid," he said. "I'd have run, too, if I'd had the option. Agent Davis and I, we knew what we were getting into. You got us here. That's what counts. They took it away, whatever was. And after that, the killing stopped. We lost 2 more hikers that year, but they died from exposure, just the usual hazards of the wilderness. The butterflies, they all disappeared that same day. And I hope to God they never come back. But every now and then, especially when winter starts to fade and the weather gets warmer, I can't help but think about that spring. And I'll tell you one thing, I'm always keeping an eye out for butterflies now. You never know when those damn things might show up again." "Another round, barkeep," I slurred, leaning heavily on the sticky counter of the Blue Flame. My buddy, Alex, beside me, echoed the demand with a clumsy cheer. We were several beers deep, feeling the warm buzz that only a Thursday night at our favorite dive could deliver. But the bartender, a guy with a mustache that could rival a walrus, wasn't having it. He just shook his head. His eyes narrowed in a way that suggested he was seriously rethinking his career choices. "You boys have had enough," he grunted, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Enough." I scoffed. "You call this enough? You greedy bastard. You're probably hiding the good stuff for yourself." "Yeah, maybe not my finest moment." Walrus Statue didn't appreciate it either. He gave me a look that could curdle milk, then jerked his head towards a dark corner of the club. 2 hulking shadows detached themselves from the pulsing mass of bodies on the dance floor, moving towards us with the grace of particularly menacing refrigerators. My brain, albeit a little fuzzy, recognized a losing battle when it saw one. This was my last chance. I grabbed the nearest beer pitcher, thankfully empty, even I wasn't that far gone, and aimed it at the bartender's face, specifically that ridiculous mustache. He ducked, quick as a weasel, and the pitcher smashed against the wall behind him, right into the neon sign that ironically read, "Drink responsibly." After that, things get hazy. I remember shouting something, probably something heroic and witty. I remember taking a swing at one of the refrigerator men, and I definitely remember a fist connecting with my jaw, sending a shockwave of pain through my skull. Then blackness. When I came to, I was being dragged. My head felt like it was filled with cotton balls and angry bees. I managed to pry my eyelids open, and the world swam into a blurry, colorful mess. My peripheral vision was shot, but I hoped it was just Alex and maybe another friend dragging me out of the bar. My eyelids fluttered closed again as a gust of fresh, cold air hit my face. Then I was airborne. For a brief, terrifying moment, I was weightless. Then thud. Reality came crashing back, literally. I lay there, staring up at the club's entrance. The red neon sign above spelled out, "Blue Flame." It always seemed like a weirdly hopeful beacon in this grimy part of town. The few streetlights that still worked were more like sad, flickering reminders of a better time. Something warm and sticky trickled down my cheek. I was probably bleeding, but before I could really care, I saw it. Across the street, stuck to a lamp post bathed in the orange glow of the dying light, was a poster. Even in my state, I could make out the bold letters, "Your FBI wanted." Below the headline were two black and white photos of a guy who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a noir film. Trench coat, a sharp gray suit, a black tie clipped neatly in place. In both pictures, his eyes were hidden under the shadow of a silver fedora, leaving only his clean, shaven jaw visible. I was in no condition to be analyzing mugshots, but the longer I stared into the darkness where his eyes should have been, the more uneasy I felt. Something about it just didn't sit right. I forced myself to look away, just as my consciousness finally gave in to the sweet embrace of oblivion. My eyes closed, and the world faded to black once again. We never talked about what happened afterward. It was a tacit agreement between us. The Blue Flame was not a place to return. After getting patched up and paying some exorbitant damages to avoid any legal trouble, said the place was shady as hell. They wouldn't risk the cops sniffing around. We were strongly encouraged to never show our faces there again. We were more than happy to oblige. That night went straight into the vault of things we don't speak of. A month later, Alex called me with a proposition. "Dude," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement, "we're going north. Pack your ski gear and be at my place Saturday, 9 a.m. sharp." I knew exactly what he was hinting at. "Ethan, you crazy son of a bitch." I grinned. "And I'll be on time." I owed him one after the whole getting my face rearranged incident. Saturday morning arrived, and for once, I was actually ahead of schedule. I left an hour early for Ethan's place, taking the Beltway to avoid the soul-crushing traffic of downtown. The sun was just starting to peek over the skyline, painting the buildings in soft hues of orange and pink. I allowed myself a small, smug smile. This might be the first time in recorded history that I was actually early for something. When I pulled up to Ethan's apartment complex, he was already out in the driveway, his old Chevy van rumbling like a contented beast. The crisp morning air nipped at my face as I got out of my car, the scent of pine needles and exhaust fumes mixing in the air. Ethan, ever the efficient one, had already brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to raise the dead. We chugged it down, loaded our gear into the back of his van, and hit the road. Fast forward a few hours, and we were pulling into the parking garage of the Mountain Vista Lodge, the hotel Ethan had mysteriously booked. It was 11:19 p.m., according to the van's clock. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, with blonde hair and bright, almost unnervingly cheerful eyes, greeted us at the reception desk. Ethan, ever the charmer, leaned on the counter, flashing her his best "I'm a harmless but fun-loving guy" grin. "Reservation under the name Hayes?" he asked, his voice a smooth baritone. After checking our IDs and clicking around on her computer for a bit, during which she kept glancing at Ethan, the receptionist's smile returned. "Room 106, she said, her voice a little breathless. She pulled a keycard from under the counter and held it out. Ethan, his eyes never leaving hers, took the card with a slow, deliberate movement. "Thanks," he drawled, his grin widening. As we walked away, I swear I saw her bite her lower lip, her gaze following us. I glanced back at Ethan, who looked like the cat that got the canary. Our room was standard hotel fare, 2 beds, a TV, and a breathtaking view that was currently obscured by darkness. We were too tired to care. We dragged our luggage in, kicked off our shoes, and collapsed onto the beds, the events of the Blue Flame feeling like a lifetime ago. Morning light eventually pried my eyes open. The smell of, was that bacon? Ethan was already up, apparently having made friends with the hotel's breakfast buffet. After stuffing ourselves with enough food to fuel a small army, we headed back to the reception desk, hoping to find out where the best ski slopes were. Blondie was gone, replaced by a guy in his 30s with a bored expression and a name tag that read Mark. He pointed us towards a gondola lift that would take us up to the local ski resort. "Enjoy," he mumbled as we headed for the exit. Not exactly the enthusiastic send off we were hoping for, but whatever. The gondola station was a short walk away. The closest cable car was small, maybe big enough for 4 people, with a bright blue stripe running along its side. The glass doors slid open with a hiss, and we stepped inside, propping our skis and poles against the worn leather seats. Above the doors a rectangular display flashed, "Watch your step." We waited and waited. For a solid minute, the doors stayed open, like the gondola was having second thoughts about taking us. Finally, with a groan, they slid shut. I cleared my throat, looking out the window. The view was breathtaking. Acres of snow-covered forest stretched out before us, a vast white blanket punctuated by the dark green of pine trees. A frozen lake shimmered in the distance, reflecting the sunlight like a giant mirror. In the far distance, towering mountains lined the horizon, their peaks capped with snow. The only sign of civilization was a red and white cell tower poking up above the trees. I looked over at Ethan, expecting to see him equally awestruck. Instead, he was frowning, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Dark clouds were gathering there, their edges tinged with an ominous purple hue. The gentle breeze that had been playing with our hair earlier was now colder, sharper, carrying a hint of snow, and it was blowing in the opposite direction of the approaching clouds. That wasn't right. Ethan said, his voice low and serious, "You grabbed the water bottles, right?" I stared at the darkening sky, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "Yeah, they're in the bag." The wind picked up, and our little cable car started to sway, like a boat on a rough sea. The gentle hum of the gondola's machinery was now punctuated by creaks and groans. Then, with a deafening crack and a long, drawn-out beep from the overhead speaker, we lurched to a halt. We swung there, suspended hundreds of feet above the ground, the wind howling around us like a banshee. I looked down, trying to gauge the distance to the ground. A giant pine tree directly below us made it difficult to judge. The speaker remained silent. The only message on the display above the door now read, "Do not move." As the last rays of sunshine were swallowed by the storm, those words felt less like instructions and more like a grim prophecy. Then, a sickening clunk from somewhere to our right. I looked out just in time to see another gondola car detach from the cable and plummet towards the earth. It wasn't alone. One by one, the other cars followed, falling like metal teardrops into the swirling snow below. We waited, holding our breath, until a sharp click above us signaled our turn. For a split second, we were weightless, suspended in mid-air. Then, with a bone-jarring crash, we hit the ground. We didn't black out, thank God. We just lay there, stunned, taking inventory of our limbs. Miraculously, nothing seemed broken. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, snow crunching under my hands. Ethan was still sprawled on one of the seats, his eyes wide with shock. After a few shaky breaths, we managed to pry the mangled doors off their hinges and tumbled out into the snow. Turns out, we'd landed in a surprisingly deep snowdrift, which had cushioned our fall. About 50 meters ahead, we could just make out the outline of another ski lift, half buried in the snow. "We gotta check it out," I said, my voice hoarse. "Maybe someone else." "Don't bother." Ethan cut me off, a hint of grim resignation in his voice. I didn't see anyone else on those things besides us. We stood there in silence, the wind whipping around us. The only sound a low, rumbling groan from somewhere up above, like the mountain itself was protesting this turn of events. "We can't be far from the resort," I said, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. Ethan gave me a look that could only be described as, "Are you kidding me? You wanna hike through a blizzard?" I gestured towards our sorry excuse for skis. "Now sticking out of the snowdrift, we've got the gear." He didn't argue. What else were we gonna do? Freeze to death? Within minutes we were skiing, or rather stumbling on skis, in the general direction of where we thought the resort should be. The dark clouds above continued to swirl in that unnatural, unsettling way. The light snowfall we'd encountered when we crashed had quickly escalated into a full-blown blizzard. Visibility was near zero. I could barely see Ethan a few feet in front of me, his form a blurry outline in the swirling white. The trail, if you could even call it that, narrowed, becoming a tight corridor between walls of snow-laden pines. The wind howled in our ears, a constant, deafening roar that made it impossible to tell if the shouts I thought I heard were real or just my imagination. I was breathing hard, each exhale a sharp puff of white in the frigid air. I was concentrating so hard on putting one ski in front of the other that I almost missed it. A flicker of movement to my right. I whipped my head around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second, I thought I saw a face in the trees. I blinked hard, ice crystals stinging my eyes. I lifted my goggles. Nothing. Just the swaying branches of the pines, their dark forms barely visible in the swirling snow. I must have been hallucinating. The cold, the fear, the lack of oxygen, it was all messing with my head. We skied on, each minute an eternity. Then, without warning, we slammed into something hard. I recoiled, instinctively raising a gloved hand to shield my face from the blizzard's icy blast. Through the swirling snow, I saw it. A towering figure, at least 2 meters tall, clad in what looked like a full suit of armor. It was covered in rust, the metal pitted and scarred, but its imposing silhouette was unmistakable. The helmet was large and ornate, masking its face completely. The armor's design looked Eastern, maybe. We stood there, frozen, for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. The blizzard raged around us, a maelstrom of white. I finally got a good look at the details of the armor's mask, at the place where a face should have been. The eye holes were too large, unnaturally so, and the mouth. It was a gaping maw, stretched wide in a way that seemed to defy the physical limitations of metal. The whole thing was just wrong. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and tapped the figure's mask. Stupid, I know, but curiosity, or maybe just the sheer absurdity of the situation, got the better of me. The metal was cold under my glove, and it didn't echo. "It's not hollow," I said, turning to Ethan. He was staring at the figure, his eyes wide. He pointed. The figure's hand. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it rose, until it covered the mask's grotesque features. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't some old, abandoned suit of armor. This thing was alive. I leaned closer, trying to see if there were any wires, any sign of machinery, when the figure's fingers clenched into a fist, gripping the edges of the eye holes. The corners of its mouth seemed to stretch even wider, as if it were grinning. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to twist its hand. The metal of the mask moved. It contorted and deformed, like it was made of clay, not steel. A thin crack appeared, revealing something underneath. Pale, cold skin. Ethan lost it. He started yelling, a primal scream swallowed by the wind. We scrambled back, trying to get our skis moving, our hearts pounding in our chests. A wheezing sound, like air being forced through a constricted passage, echoed from the woods around us. It wasn't just coming from behind us, it was coming from all sides. More figures emerged from the trees, their movements stiff and jerky, their faces twisted into expressions of pure malice. They didn't chase us, not exactly. They just stood there, their heads turning to follow our progress, their grotesque features illuminated by the swirling snow. I risked a glance at one of them for too long, and my ski caught on something. I went down hard, my skis tangling beneath me. I was trapped. All I could do was crawl, desperately trying to put some distance between myself and those things. Through the blinding snow, I could just make out Ethan's form. He was struggling to get me back on my feet, his movements frantic. I tried to help, but my limbs felt like lead. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow, getting closer. Not far, just a few meters to our right. Bam! A gunshot ripped through the air, followed by a deafening, almost bear-like roar. "Get!" a voice barked. Pushing off one knee, I managed to lurch forward, towards the sound of the voice. The ground trembled with each heavy footstep of whatever was chasing us. I looked up, trying to see who our unlikely savior was. Oop ahead and to the right. I yelled to Ethan, my voice barely a whisper in the howling wind. We were close to a cabin, a large wooden structure with double doors at the front. I heard a snarl to my left, and I ducked, just as something whizzed past my head, grazing my neck. The figure in front of us practically kicked the cabin doors open. He stopped abruptly, glancing back at us. He was close enough now that I could see his face, a park ranger, judging by his uniform. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a thick, bushy mustache. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Pity, regret. Another roar, closer this time. We weren't going to make it. I looked back at Ethan, a silent farewell. But before I could turn away, something slammed into me from behind. I was thrown forward, through the doorway, my arm smashing against the frame, sending one of my skis flying off into the snow. I landed hard on my side, my head spinning. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan trip just as he reached the door. I was helpless to do anything as the ranger slammed the doors shut, yanking Ethan inside at the last possible second. Something huge slammed against the doors from the other side, the wood splintering under the impact. I braced myself, shielding my face, waiting for the inevitable. But the blow never came. The only sound was the howling wind and our ragged breathing. We were safe. For now. We sat there for a long minute, catching our breath, the adrenaline slowly draining from our bodies. The ranger stood by the door, his back to us, listening. "You got lucky," he finally said, his voice flat and emotionless. He turned around, and I got a better look at him. Pale green ranger's uniform, a bit rumpled. Tired eyes that had seen too much. I unclipped my remaining ski and stood up, facing him. "What the hell was that?" I asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What are those things?" The ranger sighed, a deep, weary sound. He walked over to a window, carefully removing his hat and placing it on a cluttered desk next to a large stack of files. "Son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I hate to say this, but you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." He turned to face me, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You want something hot to drink? Coffee? Tea?" Before I could answer, he was already moving around the cabin, lighting a kerosene lamp, the warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He found a kettle and filled it with water from a large jug, then placed it over the dying embers of a fire in the hearth. "Storm knocked out most of the power lines," he explained, gesturing towards the window with his chin. Outside, the blizzard still raged, a swirling vortex of white. "There are a couple more outposts in the area. We lost contact some time ago." He stared out at the storm, his expression unreadable. "And nobody's going out there." A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The blizzard was one thing, but those things out there. Ethan, who had been strangely silent since we got inside, threw a few more branches onto the fire. They crackled briefly, then settled into a low, sullen burn. "We're out," he declared, his voice rough. "I doubt those twigs are gonna keep this place warm for long." The ranger leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "The excess storage of wood is next to the main outpost, just a few miles from here. So we freeze our balls off for the night." "No problem," Ethan muttered, still clearly shaken from our near-death experience. The ranger looked at him sharply, a flicker of something suspicion in his eyes. "The cold isn't what we should fear right now," he said, his voice low. "Not those things, either." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "There's something else out there. Something worse." "In that case," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "who's taking the night shift?" "Not you, that's for sure." The ranger stood up, gesturing towards a narrow staircase in the corner of the room. "2 bedrooms up there. Get some rest." I should have protested. I should have demanded answers. But I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. And frankly, I was scared. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were a chaotic jumble of images, falling gondolas, grotesque metal faces, and endless, snow-covered stairwells. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was trapped in a stairwell, the kind you find in the emergency exits of tall buildings. I looked over the railing and saw stairs stretching up and down as far as the eye could see. Then I saw it. One of those metal creatures, leaning against the railing, its face a blank, metallic mask. But it spoke, its voice a distorted, echoing rasp that seemed to fill the entire stairwell. "Having fun yet?" it asked, its eyeless face somehow conveying a sense of cruel amusement. "I'll admit your rescue was quite a stroke of luck," it continued, the flickering lights above us casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Its voice deepened, becoming more guttural, more menacing. "And it's one you won't get again." I tried to run, to escape, but my legs felt like lead. The darkness seemed to be creeping up the stairs, swallowing the light floor by floor. The creature started to move, its movements slow but relentless. I could hear the rasp of metal on concrete as it ascended the stairs towards me. I cowered in a corner, waiting for the inevitable. Then, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I fumbled in the darkness for a light switch, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic. A lighter, and next to it, a pocket knife. I grabbed them both. With trembling hands, I flicked the lighter, the small flame a fragile beacon in the darkness. I crept out of the room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. A window at the end of the hall revealed a faint, pre-dawn glow. The storm was beginning to subside. I made my way downstairs, past a wall covered in photographs, too dark to make out the details, and into the main room. My gaze fell on the ranger's desk and the pinboard above it. It was a chaotic mess of newspaper clippings, photographs, and notes, all connected by a web of colored string. And in the center, pinned prominently, was the FBI wanted poster, the one I'd seen a month ago, outside the blue flame, the detective with the hidden eyes. I almost dropped the lighter when the door creaked open behind me. The ranger stepped inside, quickly shutting the door against the lingering chill. He looked even paler than before, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Didn't sleep well?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "Consider yourself lucky you got some." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the pinboard. "You find anything interesting, kid?" "I've seen his picture before," I said, pointing to the detective's photo. "Outside a bar, a month ago." The ranger walked over and stood beside me, his eyes fixed on the poster. A faint smile touched his lips. "Inspector Harding, 2nd Precinct," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You knew him." "We worked a few cases together. When he was on the job, no case ever went cold," the ranger said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Until his own." He sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "One investigation. It changed him," he snapped. "Went rogue, ended up with a laundry list of charges. Then he disappeared. No leads, no trace. Wanted in the state." He paused, then added quietly, "And I think he's not far from here." He walked to the kitchen area, opened a glass cabinet, and took out a bottle of scotch. "In the winter months, 50 grams keep the heart healthy," he stated, pouring himself a generous amount. He glanced at me. I shook my head, declining. He was looking for something. The ranger continued, his voice barely audible above the gentle clinking of the ice in his glass. "Something. Out here." He took a long swig of his drink, his eyes fixed on the swirling snow outside. "Something he shouldn't have found." The first rays of dawn were starting to break through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light on the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence, and in that silence I knew one thing for sure. Our ordeal was far from over. We were trapped in a remote corner of the world, with creatures straight out of a nightmare, and a missing detective who might be the key to it all, or the cause. As I looked out at the vast, unforgiving wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those metal eyes were still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, and that Inspector Harding, wherever he was somehow connected to it all. The chilling wind outside was nothing compared to the icy dread that settled in my heart. This was just the beginning. Our escape from the gondola was not an end, but a prelude to something far more terrifying, and I had a sinking feeling that we were all about to be dragged into the heart of it. All right, so picture this 3 weeks ago. My buddy Mark hits me up. "Yo, wanna go camping?" he asks. Now, I'd just wasted my entire summer slaving away at work, so I was like, sure, why not? I was dying for a break from the grind, both at home and at my soul-crushing office job. At first, it was just going to be me and Mark. But as the weekend got closer, he kept adding people to the roster. Suddenly, it went from 2 dudes to a full-blown party of 6. We had Sarah, a girl from high school. Then there was John, a friend of Sarah's. I didn't know him well. Emily, John's sister, and lastly, there was Alex, a childhood friend of mine. I hadn't seen him in a while. Here's the thing, I'm not exactly a people person. Crowds stress me out, and I'd much rather be curled up indoors with a good book. When I heard Alex was coming, I wasn't thrilled. Not that Alex is a bad guy, he's just loud. Really loud. and he has this habit of talking over everyone. I know, I sound like a total grump. My mom's old SUV could fit all of us, plus our gear, if we squeezed in like sardines. But a part of me was seriously considering bailing. The problem was, if I dropped out, the whole trip was probably off. Mark's car was tiny, definitely not big enough for 6 people and all their stuff. I tried to push those feelings down. I figured a little bit of social torture would be good for me, right? Character building and all that. I mean, so what if I was mildly annoyed for a couple of days? I could handle it. It was a small price to pay for a weekend with my friends, or so I thought. I told myself I was being selfish. It wasn't that big of a deal. So, like an idiot, I kept my mouth shut and agreed to drive. Looking back, that was my first mistake. So, we packed everyone into the SUV, and let me tell you, it was a tight squeeze. Imagine 6 adults trying to fit into a clown car. Except the car wasn't very funny, and neither were most of the adults. We were off. I was the designated driver, which, in hindsight, was probably a tactical error on my part. The drive was supposed to be 2 hours. 2 hours of pure, unadulterated torture. For starters, Alex refused to follow the no smoking rule. I swear that guy went through a whole pack of cigarettes in the first hour alone. And if the smoke wasn't bad enough, he kept cracking these awful jokes that were more offensive than funny. Honestly, the only thing that kept me from driving us into a ditch was Sarah. Sarah was an interesting case. We were actually pretty close in high school, but then life happened. I got buried in work and school, and we just kind of drifted apart. I was worried things would be awkward between us, but surprisingly, it wasn't. It was like no time had passed. We picked up right where we left off, gossiping and laughing like teenagers. She spent most of the drive distracting Alex, which was a godsend. If it weren't for her, I might have actually lost it. I'll admit, by the time we finally reached the trailhead, I was beyond relieved to get out of that car. My back ached, my head was pounding from the smoke, and my patience was thinner than a cheap napkin. We parked in this empty lot near the start of the trail. It was kind of weird, actually. I expected it to be packed with cars, especially on a weekend. But nope, it was just us. Mark, in his infinite wisdom, told us he knew this amazing campsite by the lake. Secluded, peaceful. The catch: it was a 2-hour hike. Now, a 2-hour hike for a normal group of people is one thing. But our group, we were the opposite of normal. We were like a herd of particularly unmotivated cats. First, we had to use the bathroom at the trailhead, which took an eternity. Then, we had to get all our gear on. You wouldn't think it would take 6 grown adults 10 minutes to put on backpacks, but you'd be wrong. I kept my mouth shut through all of this, mostly because there was nothing I could do. I even managed to stay silent when, 5 minutes into the hike, Emily realized she'd left her phone in the car and insisted on going back for it. So much for a peaceful escape into nature. At this rate, we'd be lucky to reach the campsite by nightfall. We were supposed to get there around 4, but now it was looking more like 6. Maybe later. It was going to be close if we wanted to set up the tents with some daylight left. But hey, at least everyone else seemed relaxed. As we walked, we naturally broke off into pairs. I found myself walking with Sarah, listening to her talk about her summer. She'd been doing all sorts of exciting things, traveling, interning, you name it. Me, I'd just been working. My life was about as exciting as watching paint dry, so I mostly just nodded along, letting her do the talking. About an hour into the woods, we finally encountered another sign of human life. Up until then, it had just been us, the trees, and the occasional chirping bird. We came across this guy hiking in the opposite direction. He was the only other person we'd seen all day. He was dressed kind of strangely for such a hot day. I mean, it was nearly autumn, but summer was still holding on tight. It was scorching, and this guy was wearing a baggy, gray sweater. He also had this enormous backpack that looked like it weighed more than he did. He was skinny, all limbs and angles. You'd think he had rocks in that thing. Mark and Alex were at the front of our group, and when the stranger stopped to wave, we all kind of gathered around. It was a chance to catch our breath, and for Alex, another excuse for a smoke break. "You all just hiking or camping?" the man asked. He had a friendly smile and a slight southern drawl that made him instantly likable, even if he did look a bit out of place. Mark nodded down the trail. "Camping. We're setting up near the eagle's nest." He lied. Now, I hadn't been in this area since I was a kid, and I'd completely forgotten about the eagle's nest until Mark mentioned it. It was this massive, old tree in a clearing, and a long time ago, someone had carved a basic eagle's face into the bark. It was a well-known landmark, and it was pretty close to the end of the trail. A good spot, or so I remembered. "That's a good spot, though some folks say it's bad luck," the stranger said, unfazed. "Me, I'm just out here gathering. I'll stop by the ranger's cabin on my way out. Have y'all checked in yet?" He had a mesh bag hanging from his pack, filled with what looked like mushrooms. And get this, he also had a bunch of plastic whistles clipped to his bag. This guy was prepared for anything, it seemed. He looked like he was ready to fight off a bear with nothing but a whistle and a bag of fungi. "Checked in?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Do we need to check in?" The group gave me a look. I realized what was happening. They probably didn't want to pay the camping fee, and they figured if they didn't check in, they wouldn't have to. The stranger just smiled. "The park runs on donations," he explained. "But even if you can't afford one, it's always a good idea to let the rangers know you're here, just in case." "You got a GPS?" "Yeah, we got one," Mark said, a little annoyed. It's not our first rodeo. He clearly didn't like being lectured by this guy. I could see why Mark felt that way. The stranger seemed a little too perfect, too clean-cut to be a real outdoorsman. He looked like the kind of guy who would forage for mushrooms just to make a trendy TikTok video about it. I glanced down at his feet. The man was wearing flip-flops. Seriously, who hikes in flip-flops? He adjusted his pack, seemingly oblivious to Mark's irritation. "Do y'all have whistles?" he asked, then proceeded to pull a few off his bag. He explained that he'd wanted to buy just one, but they were cheaper in bulk, so he just handed them out to people he met on the trail. When he bent down to grab the whistles, the collar of his baggy sweater slipped, and for a second, we all got a glimpse of a surprisingly toned chest. Sarah and Emily definitely noticed. Sarah gave me a not so subtle nudge, and I followed her gaze. Yeah, the guy was ripped. Who knew? To Mark's displeasure, we all ended up taking a whistle. The stranger, sensing he might be overstaying his welcome, readjusted his pack. He gave a little wink to Sarah and Emily, letting them know he'd caught them staring. They, of course, pretended to swoon, like schoolgirls with a crush. I tied the whistle to my belt loop, feeling a little awkward. The group started teasing me, joking that the wink wasn't meant for the girls but for me. Emily pretended to be upset, saying she wouldn't mind meeting the handsome stranger in the woods at night. Finally, we parted ways with the whistle-wielding, flip-flop wearing, surprisingly buff forager, and continued our trek to the campsite, leaving the strange encounter behind us. Little did we know, that wouldn't be the last we saw of him. We finally stumbled into our campsite, sweaty, tired, and later than we'd planned. It was closer to 6 than 4, and the sun was already starting to dip below the trees. But hey, at least we made it. Everyone got to work setting up. John and Sarah seemed to know what they were doing, quickly getting their tent up. Alex, on the other hand, was struggling with his, and it took Emily shouting instructions at him to get it right. I had only ever set up a tent twice before in my life, and both times were a disaster. Thankfully, Sarah came to my rescue, and together, we managed to get mine up without too much trouble. Once the tents were sorted, I offered to help gather firewood, but John and Ben had already taken on that task, or at least, that's what they were supposed to be doing. They started off okay, but then they found a couple of branches that vaguely resembled swords, and that was the end of the firewood gathering. They spent the next half hour engaged in an epic and very loud sword fight. Mark, meanwhile, had disappeared. He reappeared just as it was starting to get dark, carrying a bag full of foraged goodies. Turns out, he actually knew a thing or two about edible plants. He'd found something called chicken of the woods, which, despite the name, is actually a type of fungus. He said it tasted like chicken when sautéed. I was skeptical, but I had to admit, it smelled pretty good when he cooked it up with some other stuff he'd brought. The sticks that John and Ben had gathered were barely enough to start a fire, let alone keep one going all night. So, I ended up helping Mark chop up some larger, drier branches with a small axe he'd brought. I mostly just carried the wood over to the fire pit while he did the actual chopping. He seemed to enjoy it a little too much, if you ask me. He had this intense look in his eyes, like he was channeling some inner lumberjack. Despite the earlier hiccups, things seemed to be going relatively smoothly. We had a decent dinner, thanks to Mark's foraging skills, and the fire was crackling nicely. But then, as the night wore on, things started to get weird. After dinner, Alex pulled out a joint. He offered it around, and to my surprise, Sarah took a hit. I'd never seen her smoke before. I politely declined when my turn came. Then, the booze came out. Someone passed me a beer, and I shook my head, passing it along to Sarah. I've never liked the taste of alcohol, and would avoid it whenever I could. Plus, I don't smoke and never will after that one time I did it in high school. Dude, you're not driving anymore. You can have one, Mark said, trying to shove the bottle into my hands. Yeah, man, Live a little, John chimed in. I took the beer just to get them off my back, but then I passed it over to Sarah. What, are you too good for my cheap beer or something? Mark asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Everyone stopped talking and looked at us. The mood shifted instantly. It was like I'd committed some major social fox pass. What? No, man. It's not that, I said, trying to diffuse the situation. You know I don't really drink. You can have one, Sarah said, holding the bottle out to me again. Her voice had a strange edge to it, too. I looked around at their faces, completely baffled. Since when was it such a big deal that I didn't want to drink? I mean, it's not like I was stopping them from having fun. I just don't want one, guys. It's not a big deal, I repeated, raising my hands in a gesture of peace. Sarah leaned in close, her blonde hair brushing my shoulder. The cold bottle pressed against my arm. I think you need to grow up, she whispered, her voice laced with anger. The silence around the campfire was deafening. Only the crackling of the flames could be heard. I was stunned. I had no idea what was going on. This whole thing had escalated way too quickly. Look, I'm just tired. It was a long hike, I said, deciding it was best to just remove myself from the situation. I'm gonna turn in. Good night. Mark and Alex exchanged a look, like they were sharing some private joke. What, is being out of the office too much for you? Ben added with a smirk. Yeah, actually, it is, I retorted, my voice tight. I was starting to get angry now. I'm not used to being outside this much anymore. So, yeah, I'm gonna go to bed. See you guys in the morning. I turned and walked away, leaving them to their booze and their weird, judgmental stares. I crawled into my tent and lay down on top of my sleeping bag. It was still too hot to get under the covers. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Had I done something to offend them? Was I being too uptight? Or was there something else going on? I started to wonder if maybe they hadn't wanted me to come on this trip in the first place. Maybe they just needed me for the ride. But why? Was it because I had a real job, a career path? Mark worked at his dad's auto shop. Ben was unemployed, living with his parents. Emily was doing some kind of social media thing. Alex was just drifting. None of them had a traditional 9 to 5 like me. But did that really matter? Did they honestly think I looked down on them because of their choices? Was I overthinking all of this? Or did my friends actually hate me? The thought stung. I lay there in the dark, listening to them laughing and talking outside, feeling more alone than I had in years. I decided then that I just needed to get through the rest of the weekend. After that, maybe it would be best if I just didn't hang out with them anymore. It hurt, but I knew I wouldn't have time for much besides work and school once the semester started. Despite the turmoil of emotions swirling inside me, exhaustion eventually took over. I drifted off to sleep, unaware that a busy schedule wouldn't be the reason I wouldn't be seeing my friends again. It would be something far, far worse. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented and confused. The sounds coming from outside my tent were wrong, really wrong. It took me a minute to fumble my way out of the tent and into the cool night air. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I wished they hadn't. Ben was sprawled out on the ground near the dying embers of the fire, clutching his head and moaning. He looked awful. His face was pale and sweaty, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of pain and terror. Then, without warning, he started throwing up, violently. "What's going on?" Emily asked, emerging from her tent with a flashlight. She shone the beam on Ben, then quickly averted her eyes. "Gross," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Ben." I knelt beside him, my hands hovering awkwardly, unsure of what to do. "Don't touch him," Mark snapped, finally joining the group. I shot him a glare, but held back a sharp reply. "Is everyone else feeling okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you saying you gave us food poisoning?" Mark's voice was rising, and he started to move towards me, his fists clenched.
No.
"I mean, not on purpose," I stammered, backing away. "Look, if we figure out if anyone else is sick, we can narrow down if it's something we all ate, or just something Ben ate." I tried to sound reasonable, but inside I was starting to panic. Mark was having none of it. He raised his fist as if he was going to hit me. That's when things went from bad to utterly insane. A sound cut through the night, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was Alex, and he was laughing. But it wasn't a normal laugh. It was a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that didn't sound human. It was the kind of laugh that belonged in a horror movie, not around a campfire with friends. We all stood there, frozen in place, listening to that awful sound. "It's too loud," Ben whimpered from the ground. He pressed his hands against his ears, rocking back and forth. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." His voice started low but quickly escalated into a scream, even louder than Alex's laughter. Suddenly, Ben shot up and grabbed a burning log from the fire pit with his bare hands. Before any of us could react, he swung it at Alex. I lunged forward, tackling Ben before he could connect. He dropped the log, his hands badly burned, but he didn't even seem to notice. I said, "Make him shut up." Ben roared, his eyes wild. Sarah and Emily stumbled back, fear etched on their faces. Then, out of the darkness, something charged into the campsite. It moved so fast, it was a blur. It made these guttural, inhuman noises, like a wild animal. It rammed into Alex, finally silencing his horrific laughter. He was thrown backward, hitting a tree with a sickening thud. The girls screamed, and I jumped back, my heart hammering in my chest. In the moonlight, I could make out the shape of a large buck, a deer. But it wasn't normal. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it moved with a jerky, unsettling grace. Mark, in a moment of sheer panic, picked up a bottle and threw it at the deer. It was a terrible idea. The next few minutes were a chaotic frenzy of movement. The deer charged through the campsite, tearing through tents and scattering our belongings. It was a miracle no one else got hit. It finally fled back into the woods, dragging Mark's tent behind it, a rope tangled around its leg. Ben slowly sat down, hugging his knees to his chest. He looked strangely calm, almost catatonic. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was reeling. What was going on? Was this some kind of collective hallucination? Had someone spiked the food? We needed to get out of there. And fast. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around my phone. Relief washed over me for a split second, only to be replaced by a fresh wave of dread. No signal. Of course. Does anyone have a working phone? I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah and Emily clung to each other, too terrified to move, let alone answer. I turned to Mark, who was slowly making his way over to Alex's body. I wanted to check on Alex, to see if he was okay, but I wasn't sure if it was safe to move him. "Do you have one of those satellite phones?" I asked Mark, desperation creeping into my voice. "Not all of us are made of money like you." He snapped, his face contorted with rage. I was stunned. Where was all this hostility coming from? "First of all," I said, my voice rising, "that has nothing to do with the situation at hand. And second, I'm not made of money. I'm barely scraping by." My stomach was churning. This was all falling apart so fast. "This is why I hate hanging out with you. It always goes back to your dead parents," Mark yelled. I stood there, speechless, my mouth agape. I couldn't process any of this. We needed to get help, and we needed it now. Without a working phone, our best bet was to get back to the SUV. Then I remembered the stranger from the trail, the one with the whistles. He'd mentioned a ranger's cabin. Maybe they had a radio or some way to call for help. "I'm going to head back to the car," I announced. "Mark, you know these woods better than any of us. You should go to the ranger's cabin. See if you can get help. Anyone is welcome to come with me." Strangely, both Sarah and Emily shook their heads. At first, I thought they were going to go with Mark, but they said they'd stay behind with Alex and Ben. I looked at Ben, who was still sitting silently, staring into space. I didn't like the idea of leaving them alone, especially with Ben in that state. And what if that crazed deer came back? But they both insisted. Neither of them could drive, so it made more sense for me to go to the SUV anyway. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark said he needed a minute to collect himself before heading to the ranger's cabin. I took a few steps down the trail when I heard it, screaming, coming from the campsite. Against my better judgment, I turned and ran back. But as I got closer, a deer suddenly appeared, blocking my path. It was the same one from before, I was sure of it. It stood there, staring at me with those strange, glowing eyes. More screams echoed through the forest, and I felt a surge of panic. I was trapped. I tried to move around the deer, but it mirrored my movements, blocking me at every turn. It raised its head and let out that same unearthly bellow, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within my bones. Fear took over. I turned and ran, not towards the campsite, but away deeper into the woods. I ran blindly, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically, the sounds of the forest twisting into a cacophony of terror. Some sounded like the girls' screams, others were noises I couldn't identify, noises that didn't seem to belong to any earthly creature. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I was so focused on escaping that I didn't see the edge of the ravine until it was too late. I stumbled, lost my footing, and tumbled down the steep slope, the flashlight flying from my grasp. I slammed against rocks and roots, my body screaming in pain. I landed at the bottom in a heap, dazed, bruised, and utterly terrified. It felt like I was still falling, even though I was lying still. I knew I had to move, but I couldn't. I was trapped, alone, and in more pain than I'd ever been in my life. And then, through the ringing in my ears, I heard a voice. "Are you all right?" I couldn't speak. I managed to raise a hand and give a weak thumbs up. I could just make out a figure standing at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was him, the stranger from the trail, the one with the whistles. He was missing his oversized backpack, and he'd changed into a dark, long-sleeved shirt. But it was definitely him, the whistle guy. "Hang on," he called down. "I'll get you." Before I could even think to protest, he started making his way down the ravine. And let me tell you, this guy moved like he was part mountain goat. He practically glided down that steep slope, sure-footed and agile. It was impressive and a little unsettling. He reached me in no time, crouching down to assess my injuries. "Did you hit your head? Do you think it's okay to move you?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Yeah, I think so," I managed to croak out, my throat raw. "But we need to get back to my friends. They're in trouble. Weird stuff is happening." I tried to sit up as I spoke, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. Suddenly, a strong hand grasped my wrist, and with surprising ease, he helped me to my feet. He then bent down on one knee, offering his back. A piggyback ride. "Seriously, I'm not a koala," I said, trying to sound tough, even though I felt like I was about to fall apart. "This will be faster," he replied simply. I hated that he was right. I was in no condition to climb back up that ravine on my own. So, with a sigh of resignation, I let him hoist me onto his back. He stood up effortlessly, and we were back at the top of the slope in under a minute. It was embarrassing, but I was grateful. My entire body throbbed, and I was pretty sure I'd twisted my ankle. "So, Mr. Cola," he said, his voice light, "what's your name?" "I'm Ethan." "James," I mumbled, feeling a bit sore. He started walking, and I tried to point him in the direction of the campsite, but he stopped me. He tapped his nose, like that meant something. "I smell your fire pit," he said. "This way." He had a point. Our campfire was probably the only one in the area, and now that he mentioned it, I could faintly smell smoke in the air. I followed his lead, trying to match his pace, which was difficult given my injuries. "What are you still doing in the woods?" I asked, trying to distract myself from the pain and the growing sense of dread. I mean, it was the middle of the night. And after everything that had happened, I couldn't help but be suspicious. "I was ambushed by a feral squirrel," Ethan explained without missing a beat. "Had to ditch my pack to outrun it. I was hiding from it until I heard screaming." He glanced back at me. "No matter what happened to you tonight, at least it wasn't something that embarrassing." I coughed, trying to hide a laugh. It was so absurd, it was almost funny. Wrinkles appeared at the corners of his eyes, and for the first time, I saw a genuine smile. It eased some of the tension, if only for a moment. It felt good to have some attempt at humor, even if we were in a terrifying situation. We made our way back towards the campsite, my anxiety growing with each step. When we finally arrived, the scene was even worse than I'd imagined. The campsite was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Trails of fresh blood were splattered across the ground. The fire pit had been trampled, embers scattered everywhere. Ethan quickly stomped out a few spots that threatened to ignite the surrounding brush. Something glinted in the moonlight. I bent down and picked it up. It was Alex's lighter. Was I in the wrong? I asked mostly to myself. I hadn't realized I'd spoken out loud until Ethan responded. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice patient and understanding. It was strange, having someone actually listen to me, especially after the night I'd had. I still wasn't sure if I could trust him completely, but I was desperate. One of my friends was hurt badly, I explained, my voice thick with emotion. I left to go get help because none of our phones were working. Should I have forced someone to come with me? I mean, what happened after I left? What is even going on? I shoved the lighter into my pocket and started to bite my thumbnail, a nervous habit I thought I'd outgrown. "You couldn't force them to come with you if they refused," Ethan said gently. "I wish I had more answers for you. I do find it odd that none of you had service. Has it been spotty all day?" His question sparked a realization. Our phones had been working earlier, after we'd arrived at the campsite. I'd even texted my mom to let her know we'd made it okay. Why had the signal suddenly disappeared? A wave of guilt washed over me. I should have been paying more attention. My phone was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. Hope flickered when I saw a single bar of service, but it vanished the moment I tried to make a call. I held my phone up, as if that would magically restore the connection. A streak of light flashed across the sky, followed by another and another. It was a meteor shower, but faint. I hadn't known there was one scheduled for tonight. Ethan reached over and took my phone, holding it up high. I started to protest, but he just said, "I'm taller." Even with his added height, it was no use. The signal was gone. We gave up, and I tucked the phone back into my pocket, feeling defeated. I asked Mark to head to the ranger's cabin, I said, trying to focus on a plan. Maybe he left, and then something happened to everyone else. Even if he didn't reach the cabin, it might be better to go there to get help than to try to find everyone. But I don't know where it is. "I'll take you there," Ethan said, turning to start walking. "Really?" I asked, surprised. He had been so calm throughout this whole ordeal. He hadn't flinched at the sight of blood, hadn't panicked when he found me at the bottom of the ravine, and now he was offering to help me, a complete stranger, in the middle of the night, in a forest where something very, very wrong was happening. "Yes, why not?" He seemed amused by my reaction. "You don't even know us," I blurted out. It was true. I tried to help others when I could, but I rarely asked for anything in return, especially not from strangers, and certainly not something this big. "I don't know your friends, but I know you," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You're a koala in disguise." This was not the time for jokes, and yet I found myself clinging to his words. I needed to trust him, at least for now. I didn't have any other options. Before we left the campsite, we looked around for a flashlight, but came up empty-handed. I picked up the axe Mark had been using for firewood. It felt heavy in my hands, but I didn't want to leave it behind. I followed Ethan, praying that this time our journey would be less eventful. But of course, things are never that easy. We walked for what felt like hours. My body ached, my ankle throbbed, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The axe felt heavier with each step, the rough wood digging into my palms. I kept replaying the night's events in my head, trying to find some logical explanation, some thread of reason in the madness. But there was nothing. If the deer and squirrels were rabid, then why did Ben and Alex get sick? We'd all eaten the same foraged food. The only difference was that those two drank from different water bottles. Could it have been a tainted stash? But that didn't explain the deer. Suddenly, Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. His body was tense, his head cocked to one side, as if he was listening intently. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I was afraid to make a sound. Then, I heard it. A faint whistle, cutting through the darkness. My grip on the axe tightened, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. We exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between us. I fumbled for the plastic whistle Ethan had given me earlier. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get it to my lips. I blew, a shaky, uneven sound. There was a pause, an agonizing silence, and then the whistle came again, closer this time, followed by a faint cry for help. It was hard to tell who it was, but it was one of my friends. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. I started moving towards the sound, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. Every few steps I'd stop, listen, and adjust my course. Each minute felt like an eternity. Finally, through the trees, I saw a figure. "Ben," I shouted, lowering the axe. His head snapped up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. I'd never seen Ben cry before. He was always the strong, silent type, the one who held everyone else together. But now, he was just standing there, sobbing with relief. "It's so dark," he whimpered, rubbing his eyes like a child. I got scared. "Did you bring Mr. Hoppy?" I stopped a few feet away, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "Mr. Hoppy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Something was very wrong. "I want to go to bed. It's dark. But I need Mr. Hoppy to sleep," he explained, more tears welling up in his eyes. "We're going to the ranger's cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe Mr. Hoppy is there." "No, it's too dark and scary out there," he whined. "I don't want to be alone. If Mr. Hoppy isn't here, you'll have to help me sleep instead." Before I could react, he lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. I tried to pull away, but he was surprisingly strong. I still couldn't bring myself to raise the axe against my friend, no matter how strange he was acting. "Hurry up and join us, so we're not alone," he said, his voice distorted, almost gurgling. Then, to my horror, he reached up with his free hand and stuck his index finger in his mouth. He started pulling, and with a sickening tearing sound, he ripped his own mouth wider, far wider than any human mouth should be. His flesh didn't bleed much, but the wound was jagged and raw. It healed almost instantly but left his mouth in a permanent, grotesque grin. He looked less human and more like a twisted caricature. I struggled, trying to wrench my arm free, but it was no use. His eyes, once filled with warmth and humor, were now blank, vacant. Another ripple ran across his face, and the flesh on his left cheek seemed to explode outwards. It wasn't blood and guts, but something else. It looked like twisted, fleshy vegetation, a grotesque parody of flowers, bursting through his skin and fusing with his bone. It was as if his very being was being consumed and replaced by something alien. Suddenly, I felt the axe being ripped from my other hand. Then, a strong arm wrapped around my chest and yanked me backward, just as Ben's arm extended to an unnatural length, still clutching my wrist. With a swift, decisive movement, Ethan swung the axe, severing Ben's arm at the elbow. I felt myself being lifted off the ground for a moment, and then we were running. Ben didn't follow. He let out a scream, a chilling echo of the deer's earlier bellow, and collapsed. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. I felt something on my arm and looked down to see, with a jolt of disgust, that Ben's severed hand was still clutching my wrist. Ethan, breathing heavily himself, helped me pry the fingers loose. Then, without a word, he tossed the hand deep into the woods. I collapsed against a tree, my head in my hands, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was horrified by what I'd just seen, by what Ben had become. But I was also ashamed. I'd had a weapon. I could have done something. But I'd frozen, paralyzed by fear. If Ethan hadn't been there. A noise broke through my despair. Ethan had started to whistle. He stood with his back straight, staring off into the woods, whistling a cheerful, upbeat tune. He noticed me staring and stopped abruptly. I whistle when I'm nervous, he admitted, a sheepish grin on his face. And for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of genuine anxiety in his eyes. I could understand that. But did he really have to pick? Always look on the bright side of life. It was a bit much, even for me. Not exactly the best song for the moment, I commented, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I think it's the perfect song for moments like this, he countered, his smile returning, though it seemed a bit forced. Sure, we just saw something terrifying. But we got away, right? I was about to agree with him when a new voice, one that sent shivers down my spine, cut through the darkness. He use spare some snackies. It was Alex's voice, but it was wrong. Choppy and distorted, like a broken record. We were being hunted. And whatever had found us was far worse than anything we'd encountered so far. We had made too much noise. It must have been following us for some time. My legs turned to jelly. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, pressed against the rough bark of the tree, every muscle screaming in protest. Escape seemed impossible. The creature that emerged from the woods was a grotesque mockery of nature. It was a deer, but horribly altered. From the base of its neck, where the head should have been, sprouted Alex's upper torso. He was upside down, his arms dangling limply, his fingers brushing the ground. His body was fused to the creature. More of those sickening flower-like growths circled the points of connection, a grotesque parody of a floral garland. The deer thing rasped, the word seemingly ripped from Alex's vocal cords. Then, with a sickening crack, the deer's body began to rotate. Slowly, horrifically, Alex's torso swiveled around, his head lolling grotesquely, until he and the deer's head had traded places. He was facing us now, his eyes wide and vacant. "You scariest or friendies?" he asked, his head twitching with each syllable. The voice was a chilling blend of Alex's familiar tones and something else, something inhuman and predatory. The monstrosity charged, driven by a hunger that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the impact, my body trembling uncontrollably. But Ethan, once again, acted. He planted his feet, his body a solid wall between me and the approaching horror. He used the creature's momentum against it. Just as it was about to collide with him, he sidestepped and, with a grunt of effort, shoved the Alex thing with all his might. It stumbled, thrown off balance, but recovered quickly. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the axe, which had fallen to the ground nearby, and swung it with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The blade connected with the creature's face, a sickening thud echoing through the silent woods. Ethan pressed forward, using his entire body weight to drive the axe deeper. He was pushed back, his feet digging into the earth, his flops long gone. He grunted with the effort, his muscles straining. Finally, with a desperate heave, he pushed the creature to the ground. It fell with a heavy thud, the axe still embedded in its skull. Ethan stumbled back, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He let go of the axe, letting it stay where it was. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the moonlight, his body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Then he bent down, hands on his knees, and took several deep breaths. The Alex thing twitched. The deer's head, still attached to its body, began to rise, as if trying to reclaim its rightful place. But Ethan wasn't done. He moved with lightning speed, planting his foot on the creature's chest and ripping the axe free. He raised it high above his head and brought it down again and again, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. Blood splattered, staining his clothes, the ground, even my own shirt. He didn't stop until the axe handle splintered in his hands, the blade buried deep in the mangled remains of the deer's skull. He stood there, panting. Covered in blood, the broken axe handle clutched in his fist. Silence descended upon the forest, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing. He looked down at the carnage at his feet, then up at me, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of exhaustion and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. "Excuse my French," he said, his voice hoarse, "but fuck." He gestured towards the bloody mess on the ground. "All of whatever this is. That used to be my friend," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. He looked back down at the mutilated remains, his expression shifting to one of pity. The body twitched again, and I flinched, afraid it would somehow rise again. We needed to get out of there, before it did whatever it was going to do. "We're not that far from the ranger's cabin," Ethan said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Come on." He gently prodded me to start walking. I wanted to protest. I wanted to stay there and mourn Alex, as twisted as he had become. But I knew he was right. We needed to keep moving. With a heavy heart, I followed him, leaving the mangled remains of my friend behind. I hated this. I hated feeling so helpless, so scared. I hated that every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, and I hated that I didn't have any answers. Ethan stopped again, this time examining the trees and the ground, as if he was tracking something. He glanced up at the sky, at the faint streaks of the meteor shower. I wondered if he was navigating by the stars. He noticed me watching and pointed towards a pair of fallen trees. "I've memorized a lot of key locations of the woods, so I know how to get back if I get lost while foraging," he explained. "Are you from around here?" I asked. These woods were huge. He had to have been here countless times to know it so well. "No, just a good memory." He shrugged. He flexed his hands at his sides, wincing slightly. Taking down that monster must have taken a toll on him, and his feet were bare. They were cut and bruised from running through the woods. I wanted to offer him my shoes, but they wouldn't have fit. "What kind of people are your friends? I mean, what were they like?" Ethan asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the path ahead. I knew he was just trying to distract me, to keep me from falling apart, but I appreciated the effort. "Ben was our rock," I began, my voice thick with unshed tears. "No matter what, he was always the calm one. The one you could always count on. If you had a problem, he'd listen. But around Alex, he acted pretty goofy. It was the only time I ever saw him really let loose." I paused, the image of Ben's mutilated arm flashing before my eyes. I pushed the thought away. "And Alex. He wasn't the brightest, kind of annoying if you ask me. I tended to avoid him, but he wasn't a bad guy. Far from it. Super kind, always sharing what he had. He was good with animals, too. He found an abandoned and abused donkey when we just started high school. The year he took care of it was probably the best year of that donkey's life." I stopped walking. My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. I just wanted to curl up in a ball and disappear. Tears finally threatened to spill over, and I found myself chewing on my thumb again, so hard that it started to bleed. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, my voice choked with emotion. Ethan simply gave me a thumbs up, understanding that I needed a moment. He didn't push me, didn't try to offer empty platitudes. He just waited. It took a minute, but I finally managed to pull myself together. We pressed on, the faint glow of the ranger's cabin growing stronger with each step. Hope, fragile but persistent, flickered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, we were going to make it out of this alive. The sight of the ranger's cabin, a small, sturdy structure bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, was a beacon of hope in the terrifying darkness. I rushed forward, desperate for safety, for answers, for anything that could make sense of the horrors we'd witnessed. But once more, a strong hand pulled me back. It was Ethan, his face serious, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He silently motioned for me to stand behind him. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, instinctively, that something was wrong. If this place wasn't safe, I didn't know what I would do. Ethan slowly approached the cabin door, his movements deliberate and cautious. Then, in one swift motion, he threw the door open while simultaneously sidestepping. A figure lunged out from the darkness within, swinging a heavy axe. The axe head slammed into the ground where Ethan had been standing a moment before. He reacted instantly, disarming the attacker and wrestling them to the ground. He pinned the person down with a knee on their back, his movements efficient and brutal. "Let me up, you psycho!" The person yelled, their voice muffled by the ground. It was a man, his face red with exertion and fear. Ethan, satisfied that the man wasn't an immediate threat, eased up slightly. I rushed forward and helped the stranger to his feet. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Ethan retrieved the axe, a brand new one, different from the one we'd been carrying, and stepped inside the cabin, beckoning us to follow. The interior of the cabin was a scene of carnage. Blood splattered the walls, the furniture, the floor. Two bodies lay sprawled on the ground, the bodies of the Rangers. They were headless. I averted my eyes, bile rising in my throat. The coppery smell of blood was overpowering. I felt like I was going to be sick. Ethan, however, seemed unfazed. He stepped over the bodies, his gaze fixed on a bulky radio set on a table across the room. "It's broken," the stranger said, his voice flat. Despite the grim situation, finding another normal person was a small comfort, and there had to be a path from here to the parking lot. We wouldn't be stumbling around blindly in the woods anymore. I had my back turned to the center of the room, so I didn't see it at first. But I heard it, a sickening, squelching sound. I turned around, my blood turning to ice. One of the headless Ranger's bodies was getting to its feet. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on strings. From the gaping wound where the Ranger's head should have been, a mass of those fleshy flower-like growths erupted. They unfurled, revealing a pulsating, blue light at their center, surrounded by a writhing mass of half-formed hands. It was even more grotesque than what had happened to Ben and Alex. Ethan, who had set down the axe to examine the radio, reacted instantly. He grabbed the weapon and took a few steps towards the creature, but it was too fast. Tendrils of flesh shot out from the pulsating mass, lashing towards the stranger beside me. I grabbed a wooden chair that was near the door and swung it like a shield. The tendrils slammed against the chair with surprising force, splintering the wood. I was thrown backward, but I held onto a large, pointed shard of the chair back. Without thinking, driven by pure adrenaline, I charged towards the creature, aiming the jagged piece of wood at the pulsating blue light. Splinters dug into my hands as I plunged the makeshift weapon into the heart of the growth. The creature convulsed, its back arching, the blue light flickering and dying. The fleshy tendrils shriveled, retracting back into the wound. The headless body collapsed, falling back to the floor, the piece of wood still embedded in its chest. I stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body, my hands throbbing. I had actually done it. I had fought back. The newcomer stood frozen, his mouth agape. Ethan walked over to the other Ranger's body and rolled it onto its back. The chest cavity began to stir, preparing to unleash another horror. Without hesitation, Ethan brought the axe down again and again, ensuring the creature stayed down. Then his gaze shifted to the stranger, who was still staring at me in shock. It was time for some answers. "What are these things?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man crossed his arms defensively and looked away. "What makes you think I know?" he retorted. I noticed a swipe card attached to his belt loop. He was wearing a short, white lab coat, definitely not standard hiking attire. He quickly tried to hide the card, but it was too late. He was busted. "I can't give you a lot of details," he began nervously. Ethan lifted the axe slightly, and the man raised his hands in surrender. Okay. I'll tell you what I know." He paused, looking from me to Ethan. "Who are you two, anyway? Hikers? Ex-military or something?" "A citizen and a koala," Ethan replied, his lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. I was starting to get really annoyed with that joke. The man narrowed his eyes, clearly doubting Ethan's words, but he continued. There was an outbreak in a different forest, a ways from here. We're still studying it. We think something infected the local plants, and then it gets passed on to the animals. I glanced down at his swipe card again, trying to make out any details. All I could see were his initials, JC. Tell us, JC, can this infection pass to humans? I asked, nodding towards the two bodies. His face paled, and he frowned, slowly shaking his head. Wes, eating a tainted plant or an infected animal, well, an infected human can infect you too. My head spun. I felt like I was going to faint. My friends hadn't just turned into monsters. They had been trying to turn us too. And then, a horrifying thought struck me. Can you be infected by eating tainted mushrooms? I asked, dread creeping into my voice. Are chicken of the woods mushrooms or fungus? Ethan added, mostly to himself. Yeah, JC said, his eyes widening. Did you two eat some? Ethan and I exchanged a grim look and nodded. JC's shoulders slumped. He looked genuinely disappointed, as if he'd been hoping we were immune. We haven't come across a lot of humans coming into contact with this infection, he continued. There's a small percentage of animals that don't react to whatever's causing all this, but we have seen people turn about 7 or 8 hours after being exposed. The biggest sign of the infection is a personality change. Some people revert to a childlike state. Others become extremely violent. If you've studied this, then there must be a cure, I said, desperation lacing my voice. JC gestured towards the mutilated body of the ranger. You think there could ever be a cure for something like that? My knees buckled, and I slid down the wall, my back pressed against the rough wood. Based on when we ate the mushrooms, I had until sunrise. Then I'd become one of them. My body would twist and change. My mind would be gone, and I'd be driven by a monstrous hunger. The only way to deal with this is fire, JC added, shrugging as if it were no big deal. It seems like whatever carries this mutation is extremely flammable. Why wasn't the park closed? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I wanted to be angry, but I was just so tired. I wasn't certain whether this forest had been overtaken or not, JC admitted, and no one wanted to spare the manpower to double check. Our hands are full because of the other location. I hired a private security contractor to come along to confirm my suspicions. And then you got spooked in the woods, ran off, and got separated from them. Ethan surmised, his ever-present smile finally fading. JC's face flushed red, confirming Ethan's guess. I couldn't really blame him. He'd at least made it to the cabin on his own. I'm meeting Cassidy here, JC said, trying to regain his composure. We'll protect you and get you out of the woods. There is a very, very slim chance neither of you are infected. And if we are? I asked, the words barely audible. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. We'd either be killed or taken away to be experimented on. We never should have come here, I whispered, my voice thick with despair. Since we might be carrying this infection, can you at least tell us where it came from? Ethan asked, his voice calm and even. I knew he was trying to distract me, to keep me from spiraling. JC frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the question. He'd probably been told not to disclose that information, but he seemed to feel like we deserved to know. He pointed upwards, a silent gesture. I didn't understand. Was he suggesting some kind of divine intervention? It's a biblical event, Ethan asked, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. JC's face turned even redder, and he jabbed his finger upwards more forcefully. I'm gesturing towards the night sky. He huffed, exasperated. Then it hit me. The meteor shower. This thing, it came from space. An alien disease. Was that even possible? I didn't have time to dwell on it. A sudden realization jolted me back to the present. Mark. I'd asked him to come to the ranger's cabin. His body wasn't here when we arrived. That meant he was still out there. Ethan's body tensed. I quickly stood up, causing JC to look at us in alarm. I was closer to the door and made it outside first. The meteor shower was still faintly visible, streaks of light painting the night sky. It should have been a beautiful sight, but now it just filled me with dread. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the cabin. Mark. His clothes were stained with fresh blood. He lifted something heavy and tossed it towards us. It landed with a sickening thud. The severed head of a large buck, its eyes still open, its mouth moving slightly. He was here, and he wasn't alone. Why are you here? Mark asked, his voice strangely distant, almost normal. I thought you were heading to the Karga. He stood there, bathed in the pale moonlight, looking almost like the Mark I knew. But his features were slightly off, distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. I got sidetracked. I replied, my voice barely a whisper. He hadn't acknowledged Ethan or JC yet, his gaze fixed solely on me. I did what I was told, he continued. I came here. I took care of the deer that bothered Alex. They all asked me not to. All of them are my friends, and they want me to join them. But you guys were my friends first, Ta. His eyes drifted towards the woods, as if expecting our other friends to emerge. Where are the girls? I asked, a sliver of foolish hope still lingering in my heart. Sarah is at the eagle's nest. I can't hear Emily anymore. Or Ben, Mark said, his gaze unfocused. JC had mentioned he came with someone. Maybe that someone had found Ben and Emily. And if that was the case, it meant that Alex wasn't truly dead, not even after being hacked to pieces. The thought made my stomach churn. He was out there, somewhere, transformed, suffering, a fate worse than death. They want me to take you all with me. There are so many voices telling me what to do, Mark said, his head turning back to face us. His flesh rippled along his cheeks, and a cold, hard knot of anger tightened in my chest. I'm sick of it. I was jealous of you, you know that. He continued, his voice laced with bitterness. You don't have parents ordering you around. You don't have siblings. You're alone. No voices are bothering you. I was stunned. I knew Mark had a tough life, working hard to support his family, but I never realized how deeply it affected him. Hey, let's trade places, he said, a deranged smile spreading across his face. Let me crawl into your skin and be you for a little while. Ethan, sensing the imminent danger, moved towards Mark, axe in hand, ready to fight. But I stood frozen, unable to move, a strange sense of resignation washing over me. Suddenly, a mass of fleshy tendrils burst from Mark's back. I grabbed JC and pulled him out of the way. just as one of the tendrils slammed into the cabin window behind him, shattering the glass. The tendril recoiled, as if in pain. Most of the tendrils went for Ethan, recognizing him as the bigger threat. One wrapped around the handle of the axe. Ethan held on with both hands, digging his heels into the ground, trying to resist being pulled in. He was dragged forward, his body straining with the effort. Then, with a sudden Yuri move, he let go of the axe. He moved too fast for Mark to react. He pulled a small pen out of his pocket and, grabbing the side of Mark's head to steady him, plunged the pen deep into his right ear. Mark screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of agony. The tendrils flailed wildly, and he stumbled, momentarily stunned. Ethan didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed Mark's shirt and threw him to the ground. Mark ripped the pen from his ear, but it was too late. Ethan seized his head with both hands, lifting it above the severed deer antlers on the ground. Mark struggled, desperately trying to keep his head raised, but Ethan used his weight, slowly forcing him down. They strained against each other, locked in a silent, deadly battle. Finally, with a sickening crunch, Ethan forced Mark's neck onto the sharp point of an antler. Blood gurgled from his mouth, his body went limp, and his eyes rolled back in his head. When I'd pulled JC out of the way, I hadn't let go of his arm. Now, I felt him gripping my arm, his body trembling with fear. Mark's face began to transform. The fleshy flowers sprouted, covering his eyes, and his chest heaved as if something was moving beneath the skin. He was turning into one of those monsters. But Ethan didn't give him the chance. He quickly retrieved the fallen axe and, without hesitation, brought it down on Mark's head, splitting his skull. He removed the axe and swung again, and again, his movements mechanical, relentless. I was terrified, not of what Mark had become, but of what Ethan was capable of. I didn't know anything about him, not really. JC had said that infected people underwent a personality change. Was Ethan infected? Was this brutal efficiency a result of the infection, or was it something else, something inherent in his nature? The world around me started to fade. I wasn't aware that I was on the verge of fainting until JC dragged me back inside the cabin and sat me against a wall. I could hear the sickening thud of the axe outside, but my mind was shutting down. When I finally opened my eyes, the sounds had stopped. JC was rummaging around the cabin, looking for anything useful. He found a few cans of Spam, which he set aside. The thought of food made my stomach churn. I curled up, my back against the wall, my knees pulled tight to my chest. Footsteps approached, and for a moment, I hoped it was another monster, that it would all just end. But it was Ethan. He was covered in blood, but he'd cleaned his face. He slowly sat down beside me. I pressed myself harder against the wall, fear rising in my chest. It should have been me, I whispered, mostly to myself. Ethan looked at me, his expression questioning, but gentle. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that I wished I'd died in the accident that killed my parents. That if I wasn't around, maybe my friends would still be alive. Instead, I shook my head and said something else, something that had been gnawing at me all night. "I'm a guy," I said, my voice thick with self-loathing. "I should have been the one to end their suffering, not you." I just stood there like a child every time. "How old are you?" he asked. 20. I lied. He knew and waited for the right answer. 19. See, still a teenager. I'm the adult here, so I don't mind helping. I lashed out, punching his arm. It was a weak, pathetic blow, but he pretended it hurt. What's the point of being born a guy if I'm too weak to do anything? I snapped. I had always been the smallest one, the weakest, and now I'd proven just how useless I really was. Ethan reached over and took my hand. He placed his hand next to mine, showing the difference in size. "People are born different," he said softly. "Some are good at running while others have asthma. Just because you can run faster and longer doesn't make you better than anyone who can't. You have different skills. Who cares if fighting isn't one of them?" I chewed on the inside of my cheek, his words sinking in. I knew he was just trying to make me feel better, but strangely enough it worked. A little. I still should have. I began, but I couldn't finish the thought. "I've dealt with monsters before," he said quietly. "It's something I'm made for it." I looked at him then, really looked at him. I still didn't understand him. Was he here on purpose, or was it just chance? The cabin door burst open, and we both jumped. JC let out a high-pitched scream. A towering figure stood in the doorway, clad in military gear, a large blade in their gloved hand. They reached up and removed their helmet, revealing a cascade of fiery red hair. "Do you have a hair tie?" she asked, her freckled face turned towards us. Ethan and I were too stunned to speak. "Cassidy," JC exclaimed, rushing over to her. She was at least 2 feet taller than him. He found a hair elastic for her, and she tied her hair back. "Isn't long hair against some sort of regulation?" Ethan asked, finally finding his voice. "I'm in the private sector," she replied, turning to leave. "Come on." We stood up and followed her out the door. Things were finally, maybe, starting to look up. I doubted we'd have any trouble getting through the woods with her on our side. She looked like she could take down a charging bull. I thought about the slim chance that I wasn't infected, that when the sun rose, I would still be alive, left to carry the weight of this night. As we walked down the trail, my hand went into my pocket, my fingers closing around the lighter I'd taken from Alex. I slowed my pace until I stopped altogether. Ethan noticed first, then the other two. "I'm with you until the end," Ethan said, already knowing what I was going to do. JC looked confused, but Cassidy seemed to understand. "We're not going back," she stated firmly. "I need to see Sarah," I said. JC opened his mouth to protest. "Just leave her. There's no way she's still human," he exclaimed. I knew that. I wasn't going back to save her. I shook my head, and he took a step back, away from Cassidy. She grabbed his shoulder, holding him in place. "My job is to protect you," she said to JC, "not them. We're leaving." He looked from her to us, knowing he couldn't do anything. "We'll wait for you at the end of the trail," Ethan said with a small smile. We said our goodbyes, and then Ethan and I turned and walked back into the woods, towards the heart of the infection. We didn't encounter any more infected creatures on the way. The sky was getting lighter, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon. The forest seemed to watch us, the leaves and branches turning towards us as we passed. The events of the night had taken their toll on Ethan. He still gripped the axe, but he let it hang at his side, his shoulders slumped. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. He let me walk in front, following the trail towards the eagle's nest. We found the clearing, but he waited at the edge. I needed to do this alone. The eagle's nest was even more grotesque than I remembered. The fleshy flowers had completely overtaken the ancient tree, replacing its leaves, twisting its branches into unnatural shapes. The bodies of countless animals, fused together, formed a writhing, pulsating mass around the base of the tree. A raccoon, its head covered in the fleshy blooms, emerged from the woods. It didn't even glance at us as it walked towards the tree and was absorbed into the mass. Sarah was at the center of it all, her lower body fused with the tree, her upper body still recognizable. Her eyes were covered by the flowers, but her long blonde hair cascaded down, moving in the slight breeze. She looked almost beautiful in a strange, unsettling way. A faint blue light fell from between the branches, landing on the ground and seeping into it. JC had been telling the truth. This thing had come from the sky. I was starting to wonder where you were, Sarah said, her voice a distorted echo of its former self. Come over here and join us. She opened her arms wide, a grotesque parody of a welcoming embrace. In a second, I said. I want to talk first. She nodded, but she didn't lower her arms. How did you all feel about me? I asked. I mean, do you blame me? Were we all actually friends? She tilted her head, as if considering the question. We were friends. We all loved you, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Relationships aren't perfect. We were only human. I suppose, near the end, I was starting to get jealous of you. All your hard work paid off. I grinded away at my social media accounts for nothing. Meanwhile, you had no support. You got back on your feet after your parents' death, and you were going to college, unlike the rest of us. It felt like I was losing you. I never knew any of this. I should have paid more attention. I should have valued our time together instead of rushing through life. I don't blame you for all of this, she continued. None of us do. We're happy like this. No longer being human, no longer alone. It hurt at first. But now, after we shed who we were, we can live in bliss with all the other voices. Now come and join us. Let us spread to the rest of this world and become one with everything. I moved towards her, drawn in by her words, by the promise of an end to the pain, the fear, the loneliness. Ethan tried to stop me, but he was blocked by two fused deer. He hacked at them, yelling my name, telling me to stop. But I kept walking until I reached Sarah. Her arms wrapped around me, her cheek pressing against mine. It was a gesture I had always craved from her, a sign of affection I had always longed for. I always thought of you all as siblings, I said, pulling away slightly. You were the best family anyone could have ever asked for. She didn't understand. Once we were fused, she would know everything about me. She didn't see my hand reach into my pocket, didn't see me pull out the lighter. I lifted it, holding it under her exposed stomach, and stared into her flower-covered face, searching for some trace of the girl I once knew. My thumb flicked the lighter, once, twice. Ethan screamed my name. A small flame sputtered to life, and then I touched it to Sarah's flesh, She screamed a horrifying, inhuman sound as the fire spread rapidly across her body. It was like setting paper alight. The flames engulfed her, spreading to the tree, to the writhing mass of fused animals. The heat was intense. I closed my eyes, the screams of the burning tree echoing in my ears. I felt the fire spread to my own clothes, felt the searing pain. Strong hands grabbed me, pulling me away from the inferno. Ethan dragged me to the ground, frantically trying to put out the flames on my clothes with his bare hands. He lay on top of me, shielding me from the heat. "Leave," I started to say, but he slapped me, hard enough to snap my head to the side. "Don't you dare take the easy way out now," he yelled, his voice raw with a fury I'd never heard before. I stared at him, stunned into silence. The fire raged, consuming the eagle's nest, spreading through the infected forest. Smoke filled the air, making our eyes water. We struggled to our feet, coughing, our bodies racked with pain. We weren't going to make it out on foot. The fire was moving too fast. I closed my eyes, ready to accept my fate, when a new sound cut through the roar of the flames. An engine. JC and Cassidy appeared on an ATV, shouting our names. Cassidy pulled us onto the back, and we sped away, the ATV kicking up dirt and dust as we raced through the burning forest. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed out. When I woke up, I was in a hospital, my body covered in bandages. JC told me I was clear of the infection. They'd tested my blood countless times. He also told me about Ethan, that he was fine, that he'd been released. He'd even left his number on my phone. JC told me to tell everyone what happened, to warn people about the infected forests. He said it was the only way to stop this thing from spreading. So, that's what I'm doing. I'm telling my story. I'm warning you, stay out of the woods. And if you see a man in flip-flops, carrying a backpack full of whistles, maybe just keep walking. You never know who or what you might encounter in the darkness. The sunrise that morning was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, but the memory of it will always be tainted by the horrors that came before it. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the screams of the burning forest, a chilling reminder of the friends I lost and the terrifying truth that lurks just beyond the edge of civilization, waiting for the sun to go down.